So welcome. My name is Katie Wade Jaimes, and today's webinar is going to be talking about social justice for science teaching, with a particular focus on how we think about identity and equity in the STEM classroom. So I see some familiar names in the participants here, but just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Katie Wade Jaimes, and I am an associate professor here at UNLV in the College of Education. Previously, I was a science teacher, and before that, I was a practicing engineer. So that's my background. So we are looking at diversity and equity today. So I'm going to dive right into kind of understanding what we're talking about. And then we'll look specifically at why we care about this in terms of science, how that relates to identity. And I'm going to share some research and some frameworks for thinking about what this looks like in a STEM classroom. So first of all, diversity and equity, buzzwords, we're hearing them a lot, especially lately with the current political landscape. So what is it? What do we mean? Sometimes we mean access. Sometimes we mean who is able to access certain resources, certain opportunities, things like that. Opportunity, like I just said, who has the opportunity to participate in science or STEM? What does that look like? And I also like to think of it in terms of what are the types of identities that are available. And when we think specifically about science, and we're going to look at this in more detail, what are the types of identities that are available within science? Specific to science, there are a few frameworks that we think about when we think about identity, diversity, and equity. And the first one is called rightful presence. And so we're going to think about this a lot today. Who belongs in science, or who is allowed to feel as if they belong in science? Who has a rightful presence in science and in the science classroom? So thinking about how do we define that, and what messages are we sending about who belongs in science? And we're going to look at some data in just a second to get started. But we know that the majority of STEM professionals globally are men from dominant ethnicities. And we're going to look at how that plays out in the United States in just a second. And then finally, when we think about science education today, we're going to really focus on how does science education itself work to invite in or exclude certain groups from science? And specifically, what might be the role of a science teacher in those cases? So I'm going to start by showing you a little bit of data from the National Science Foundation. And I just want you to look through these slides. I'll introduce them and give you a little background, but then I just want to show you a few slides for you to think about and put your science teacher brains on and think about what you see here. So this first graph is from a study, or not, I shouldn't say a study, a report that NSF does every couple of years, where they look at who is getting a science or engineering degree, who's pursuing science and engineering as a career, et cetera. And they are specifically looking at groups that are underrepresented. And I'm going to use the terminology that the NSF uses for this, which is not always the terminology I would use. But so they're talking about underrepresented minority women and men. This is the graph that for a long time was kind of the front of this report. And if you look at it, you can see that goes back to about 1996. This was, the last year was 2016. The next few slides I show you are a little bit more updated. And it's looking at, out of all of the science and engineering degrees, what percent of those degrees are earned by groups that are underrepresented in STEM fields? And if you look, these top two lines are the bachelor's for both women and men. And then we have our master's degrees, and then we have our doctorate degrees. And you can look kind of, blur your eyes a little bit, and you can see, okay, generally from 1996 to 2016, there's an upward slope for these lines. So the message that you might get from this is, okay, I guess we're doing an okay job. We're increasing the percent of all science and engineering degrees that are earned by underrepresented women and men. So I looked at this graph and I thought, that's interesting. That doesn't quite agree with what I'm seeing happening both in K-12 classrooms and higher ed. So I pulled the data and I wanted to look a little bit closer at that. So I'm going to show you 4 graphs now, and I'm just going to give you about 20 seconds on each graph to kind of see what you think the key takeaways are. This first graph is just looking at the undergraduate degrees now, so only undergraduate degrees, and it's looking specifically at Black or African American men or women. And now it is kind of desegregated by what are the different fields that are considered science or engineering. So this time we're going all the way from 1990 up until 2020. This break here is 1999. I don't know, Y2K, y'all, there's no data for that year. But I just want you to take a few seconds to look at this graph and think about anything you notice. And I will be asking you to share in a second. So think about this one. All right. The next graph is the same graph, but now we're just looking at Black or African American women. So take about 30 seconds to look over this graph. All right, and then this graph is the same type of data, but now we're looking at the degrees earned by Hispanic or Latinx men and women. And then the last graph I'm going to show you is same type of data, but now we're looking at Hispanic and Latino women. All right, so you can share this in the chat if you feel like it, but I'm curious, what did you notice overall about the overall trends in the graphs? What are some things you noticed about the science disciplines in particular? So looking at the breakdown by discipline, and what do you wonder about after seeing these graphs? So take a minute, put any thoughts you have into the chat. All right, yeah, so the first comment, so for Black and African American, for a lot of the lines, specifically for women, a lot of the lines are either going down or staying pretty flat. And for the Hispanic Latinx populations, most of them are going up. And the question is why? What a great question. Thank you, Jennifer. Other thoughts or things you noticed about on the graphs? Yeah, so the social sciences are high for both groups. Yeah, good observation, Grace. Comparisons for earning potential and comparison to the biological sciences. Yeah, good question. Psychology is high across the board. What's driving the growth of the Hispanic populations that isn't impacting the Black and African American population? Good, great questions. Increase interest in psychology degrees. Good. Yeah, so a couple things, a couple trends then I'm seeing. So there's a difference in the disciplines, right? The ones that are high, like psychology, social science, are high across all of these populations. The ones that are low, like computer science, engineering, physical science, yeah, extremely low for Hispanic and Latinx women, and low kind of across the board for all of these underrepresented groups. Um, And then we're also noticing there's very different trends depending on which subgroup we're looking at, right? So that first graph that we saw when everything was lumped together might make you think, oh, okay, not so bad. When we start to segregate this out, though, we see actually for certain groups and for certain disciplines, things are looking pretty grim. And for me, the first time that we look at the first time I looked at this data, it was actually a little shocking to me to see how many of these lines were either stagnant or going down over decades. It's been decades of interventions of trying to increase these. And thank you, Marla, for this perfect segue. So what are the different racial identities and experiences that Hispanic people can have compared to the identities that maybe Black or African American or white people can have? And how do those identities intersect with the science identity? So we're going to look at that right now. Marla couldn't have set this up better for the next slide. So why should we care about this? So there are benefits of improving diversity and equity. We talk about it all the time. We hear about it all the time. And a lot of times we think about these individualized benefits. Oh, it's, better earning potential, better career, things like that. And that is 100% true. Everyone should have access and opportunity to engage in the careers that they want to engage in, right? Science itself benefits from diversity and equity of ideas, from increased understanding and different perspectives, and then society as well. So for the advancement of society. And if we want people and communities and individuals to be empowered to improve society, then they need to have access to tools like science and engineering. So then the question is, why does this inequity persist, right? So, and I don't know if we don't have time to go into all of the numbers on the graphs. Even for the Hispanic Latinx graphs, the percent of people earning some of these degrees is still well less than the percent of the overall population, right? So why is this inequity persisting over decades? And there have been so many different interventions that have focused on improving access, improving opportunities for women and other marginalized populations, but we're not seeing kind of the payoff of those interventions, right? I'm thinking of summer camps, after school clubs, so many great organizations, but the overall numbers in terms of degrees earned is not really changing. So some of the fields, especially fields related to health or wellness, like was pointed out, things like the social sciences are a lot higher than those other fields like engineering and math, and we're seeing losses in those fields. So even though there might be gains in some cases, there are losses in other cases. And so what I argue is that if you focus on increasing interest or achievement in STEM, that's not going to be enough, because there's no evidence to suggest that people from basically non-dominant cultures have any less interest or any less ability to do well in STEM. What I'm going to argue today is that we need to focus on who can see themselves and be seen by other people as a STEM person, or that identity piece that we mentioned earlier. So quickly going over what I mean when I talk about identity. We all have multiple identities, right? So we all show up as different people in different places. It's very context specific. The way I'm showing up right now for this webinar is very different than the way I showed up earlier when I was taking my dog for a walk, right? I'm wearing different clothes. I'm using different language. I'm gesturing in different ways. And these identities are all fluid, right? So they can change, they can intersect, they can overlap. At any moment, I might be enacting one or more different identities. When we think of identities today, we're thinking about what is that combination of how I'm acting, I'm talking, I'm dressing, what the things I'm thinking and valuing that is indicating that I want to be seen as a very specific type of person. So for instance, one identity that is very dear to me is that of a mother. So I have a daughter, and I have an identity of a mother when I'm with her. And so that identity might look like being very caring, giving her hugs, the way I talk to her in a very specific way, the way I support her, things like that. When I'm a teacher and I'm in teacher mode, that identity might look completely different, right? So now I might be dressed a little bit differently. I might be maybe a little more assertive. I might be using that teacher voice. I have different, you can see the teacher in the picture holding like the binder, the notebook, things like that. So different tools that I might use in that case. Another identity might be that of a runner. So I went for a run this morning. I obviously wear completely different clothes. If I was to show up today wearing my running clothes for the webinar, that'd be very confusing, right? So I'd be kind of enacting an identity that doesn't quite make sense with this. And then finally, we're going to think about today, what does that identity of a scientist look like, or a science person? And what are some of the things that indicate that identity? And are those things compatible with these other identities that I might have and that might be important to me? We're going to use a framework for identity, and specifically for science identity, that has three different components. So the first component is a performance. So as a society, we have defined how you perform a specific identity. So there are certain ways to act like a mom. There's certain ways to act like a runner or a teacher or a scientist. And as a society, we've kind of defined what's acceptable for that. If I show up, like I said, in running clothes and I'm giving a lecture in front of a class, then that's not really acceptable for that type of identity. So we want to think then, what do I have to do to show other people that I'm a scientist? How do I perform this identity of a scientist? Now, I can perform an identity all day long, and I can say, I'm a scientist, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But I also need to gain recognition for that. And similarly for our students, they can try to perform these science identities all day long. But who is providing that recognition for that? So again, as a society, we define what's recognizable as a scientist. So we define what are the things that we look for, what are the ways of behaving that are recognized, that we say, okay, that person is a scientist then. And when we think specifically about our students then, we want to think, who is acknowledging me as a scientist? If I am trying to perform this identity all day long and nobody is ever calling me a scientist, maybe I'm trying to publish my research and it's never published. Maybe I'm trying to present my scientific work and I'm never accepted to do presentations. Nobody's acknowledging me or seeing me as a scientist. That's going to impact that identity. And what's important with this piece is that if we're defining what is recognizable as a scientist, that means we're also defining what's not recognizable as a scientist. And that's almost more important in this case, because if that definition of who can be a scientist and who can be seen as a scientist isn't broad enough, then we're limiting those people who can actually be recognized as a scientist. Now, for science in particular, Carlone and Johnson added onto this idea of competence. Who has the opportunity to actually learn science and become good at the skills that you need to be in order to be a scientist, right? And also when we think about this, I like to think about what actually counts as scientific knowledge, right? So in a classroom, that means, are we just counting things like memorizing vocabulary words or doing well on standardized tests? Or are we talking about really engaging in scientific processes and some of those skills like asking questions, being curious, persisting, things like that? So when we put all three of these pieces together, then, if I'm able to perform as a scientist or a science person, if other people who are important to me and important in the field recognize me as a scientist or science person, and I'm really developing those skills that I need to be successful in science, then I'm going to have a strong or a robust science identity. Now, where we get in trouble here is I mentioned the idea that society defines this, right? So this isn't some kind of pure objective definition of what a scientist is. And I don't know if y'all remember these starter packs going around the internet. And so these are really just what are the discourses or the narratives around who can be recognized as a science person and who we recognize. And often, and if you've ever seen pictures drawn by children and things like that, what does a scientist look like? They're usually wearing a lab coat with safety goggles. They're doing some kind of wacky invention like the mad scientist. A lot of times they're awkward. They have no social skills. I'm thinking of Big Bang Theory. Most often they're a guy. A lot of times when we talk about in media, they're like the minor character, the side character, the scientist over in the lab. And that usually involves things like big words or knowing things like arcane knowledge, like the periodic table. Sorry that offends anyone. It's not really arcane to scientists. So when we think about if this is my view of what a scientist is supposed to be or what I have to do to be recognized as a scientist, and this isn't how I see myself in terms of my other identities, then I'm going to experience some kind of conflict. So maybe I need to do things to perform one identity and it conflicts with another identity, so I can't be recognized as both. So for example, if we think about our kind of ideas or discourses around traditional femininity, we often think of it as being soft-spoken, agreeable, you care about others. So you might, this is kind of just a stereotype of what a traditionally feminine woman might look like, right? So wearing a dress, long hair. If, on the other hand, we have these ideas around being a scientist, that you have to be confident or loud, you have to ask questions and question things and work independently, and maybe this is what a scientist might look like, these two things aren't really compatible. I can't find a way to be able to do both of those things. So I might choose not to engage in the characteristics of one identity if I don't want to sacrifice aspects of another identity. And this could be all kinds of different identities that come into conflict. And what we're going to focus on today is what those conflicts with science identities are. So instead of conflict, what we want to think about is how do we expand identities, right? So how do we expand what counts as being a scientist or a science person? So I would argue, as much as interventions are wonderful and they give students a chance to participate in STEM and the culture of STEM, we don't need to assimilate students into a narrow culture of STEM. We need to disrupt what we think of as STEM, broaden what counts as science and who can be recognized as a science person. So what if instead of the stereotype of the white male with the goggles, we see images of women of color, wearing different outfits out in nature, doing things that are definitely science and being a science person, but that we don't often think of or see portrayed of as science. Now I can say, oh, I can have this identity as a woman and maybe even as a woman of color and still have an identity as a science person because that identity of a science person is broad enough to encompass all of this. So one thing, I just want to share this resource. I know we have a lot of teachers on, iamascientist.org, and it really highlights how many different types of identities you can have and still be a science person. And you can look all different ways. You can present in all different ways. And it's a website that has posters of different scientists, but it also talks about their other identities. So you can be a ballroom dancer and a scientist. You can be a nonprofit leader, a singer, a dancer, and still be a scientist. Those things don't have to conflict with each other. All right, so what we're going to look at now is then what are the combinations of saying, doing, and being that we recognize in science and STEM, and why are those combinations recognized? So when we think about science identity in schools, and this is where most of our students, most people get their idea of what science is, right, and what counts as science or not. We first think about this presentation of science, right? When we think about a science textbook, it's a very specific canon of scientific knowledge. That is usually based on Western modern science, and it was founded in Europe by men. So the culture and the characteristics of science reflect the culture and the characteristics of middle-class white men, because they were the ones to kind of define what counted as science and at that time. When we think about performance of a science identity in the classroom, we see that often students are trying really hard to be this good student identity, right? And being a good student might conflict with what counts as being a science person. So for instance, if being a good student means you're really quiet, you're prepared, you work quickly, those might not be the things that I need to develop in order to be a science person. And we're going to look at an example in just a second. And there's also a lot of research to support that students are not able to perform a science identity without conflicting with cultural or personal identities. And often they would make the choice then that I'm just not going to perform this science identity. It's not for me. I'm not going to try to make myself fit into that mold. We also have to think then about recognition. So, and especially for the teachers joining us today, how are we providing recognition for meaningful engagement in science? It's oftentimes when we go into a classroom, we see a lot of recognition for being a good student, right? So thank you for being prepared. Thank you for doing your homework. We provide a lot of recognition around that. How do we provide recognition for meaningful engagement in science? Thank you for asking so many amazing questions. Thank you for keep trying over and over, even when things weren't going right, things like that. And then finally, are all students given access to science skills and knowledge? And whatever we're measuring, does that actually reflect authentic science learning? So for instance, if our metric for competence is a standardized test or a vocabulary quiz, does that actually reflect being able to participate in science? Is that preparing our students to perform well in science in the future? So this is I'm going to give one little snapshot from some previous research I did, specifically looking at identities available. And these were middle school African-American girls in a science class and looking at what was available for them and how did they negotiate these different identities. So in this study, I followed a seventh grade science classroom, and I also had an after school STEM club. And a lot of the same girls were in the classroom as they were in the STEM club. So I was looking at across these two spaces, how did they engage in various identities and how did those intersect with science identities? In the full study, there were 8 different identities they engaged in, but for the case study I'm going to show you today, I'm just going to include a few of them. So first, there was this idea of being a good girl. And the students would even use this language. I'm a good girl. I'm really quiet. I'm polite. I don't interrupt. I don't get out of my seat. I don't break rules, etc. Similar to that was that of a good student. So if someone wanted to be seen as a good student, they had to follow the rules, they had to be prepared, work really quickly, do well on tests. All of these were seen as being a good student. So when I asked a teacher or another student, like, who do you think a good student is and why? These are the things they would describe. In this space, there were also 2 different ways to engage with science. In the classroom or in interviews with the students, they often engaged in this identity that was meant to provoke a science identity, but kind of ended up more imitating science. So a lot of times they used big sciencey sounding words, but they weren't usually real words. They would just kind of piece together phrases that sounded scientific. They would kind of invoke stereotypical ideas around science, like wearing glasses, or pick different pictures of science. To disrupt this then in the after school club, we introduced this idea of authentic science. So are you curious? Do you want to explore and discover? We didn't have a lot of rules. A little chaotic. It was loud. It was exciting. People were exploring. And we didn't have the same restraints in the after school club that we did during the school day, right? So we were able to introduce what was hopefully going to be a more authentic version of a science identity to help sustain students then who wanted to persist in science. So I'm going to share then, this is one of the case studies, Ashanti, and this is how she participated both in school, which is the top here, as well as after school, which is the bottom here. So at the very beginning of the study, Ashanti was so into science, and she clearly identified as a science person. She was one of the students who founded the STEM club because she wanted to do more science and STEM in her life. When I asked her at the very beginning if she was a science person, she said yes, very confidently. And I asked her why, and she said, well, because I like science. So it's very simple to her. If you like science, you can be a science person. She talked about science as being courageous, trying new things. She did say you had to be smart to be, and she saw herself as being very smart, so that was very self-serving. And she wanted to be a meteorologist, and she saw that as clearly an indication that she was a science person. Over the fall semester then, she was engaging in school science as well as after school science. And in both spaces, she was working really hard to gain recognition and to perform this authentic science identity. So in her classroom, they did a science fair, and Ashanti developed this really cool science fair project where she was looking at spinning people around in chairs and then seeing how that impacted their ability to walk and their dizziness and how long it took them to recover from that. So she developed it herself. She took all the data herself, was really into it. And the after school club is when she collected most of that data. So she was really excited to get there. She helped other students out with their science fair projects. She suggested new topics, new things to talk about. So in both cases, she was looking to really perform this authentic science identity. However, in school science, in her classroom, she was also engaging in this idea of being a good girl because that was the most highly valued and recognized identity there. So even though she had lots of questions, she often didn't ask them. She was very quiet in class. She didn't raise her hand very much. And in both spaces, outside of her science identities, she was a 7th grade girl and she saw herself as being very emotional, right? And so every once in a while, she would tear up in class. She would have emotional moments. And her friends were very supportive of her, and especially in the after school club. And it was nothing out of the ordinary for a 7th grade girl, right? However, in the classroom, her science fair project was clearly one of the most ambitious and well-designed and well carried out. Her teacher chose her to represent the class to go on, but her teacher told her, okay, you can represent us, but I can't have you getting all pouty and getting upset at the science fair. And when her teacher told her that, Ashanti's kind of demeanor just immediately kind of deflated a little bit. She went back to her desk, she put her head down on her desk, and she didn't really engage in class for the rest of the day. Halfway through the year then, I interviewed her again, and I asked her now, and I think I forgot to, sorry, too many pop-ups, y'all. Halfway through the year, I interviewed her again, and now she said, I'm not a science person. And I was really surprised because I had seen her in this after school setting where she was so enthusiastic, so engaged. And I asked her, well, why aren't you a science person now? And she said, it's because you can't be emotional and be a science person. And so I asked her, well, why not? Why couldn't a scientist be emotional? And she said, you can't be gloomy. You're going to put your tears in there. So she's talking about like doing an experiment and you might get your tears in it. That's not one of the things that goes in there. So she's clearly connecting this recognition she got about being an emotional student with not being able to be a science person. There's a conflict there between those two identities. Following her then into spring semester, she now in the science classroom, she kind of abandoned this idea of doing authentic science. And she started to engage more in this discourse around imitation science. And she really doubled down on being a good student. So she actually stopped coming to the STEM club. For some days, she would go to tutoring instead because she wanted to get her grades up. She wanted to make sure she was going to do well on the test. In class, she became even quieter, more isolated. She rarely spoke at all in class at this point. But in the STEM club, when she came, she still did want to engage in the science activities. She still had ideas for engagement. However, she also started introducing this idea of being a good girl. So she started saying, these other kids shouldn't be allowed to come to the STEM club because they don't behave as well as I do, or they're not as good as I am. At the end of the year then, when I asked her if she was a science person, again, she said no, which was upsetting. However, at this point, when I said, do you think other people see you as a science person? She said yes, which was surprising. However, now she's saying that is probably because she gets the answers right a lot. She uses, and when I asked her what science was, she says, well, you use textbooks, it's theories, it's colorful, it's testing effects. So you can see she's really doubling down on, she's a good student, so that makes her a science person. But when she defines science, it's a lot more of this imitation science than it was that authentic science at the beginning of her 7th grade year. Oh, so before we go into that, so over the course of this year, then you can see, even though she started with a strong science identity, that messaging and that recognition that she's receiving throughout the year was reinforcing for her that she didn't really belong in science, that she was too emotional, that she wasn't the type of person to be a scientist. So instead, because she didn't feel recognition for that, she engaged in these other identities that she could gain recognition for. However, I would argue those identities don't set her up to be a scientist, right? Even this identity of imitation science, students are not developing the skills and the knowledge they need to be successful then when she goes on to high school or college. So we're going to think then a couple of strategies to things that her teacher could have done differently, right, in the classroom. And I want to say also that the teacher was part of the same system that the students are part of, right? So she's also got a lot of pressure for standardized testing, for things like that. And in the next study, I'm going to show you examples of ways teachers did disrupt this. But for this webinar, I wanted to just share things that I've seen teachers doing in their classrooms that are kind of like the low-hanging fruit for supporting STEM identity. So students should be actually doing science or math or STEM, not just watching it or reading about it. So in Ashanti's classroom, most of their work was following along with the PowerPoint or reading in a textbook, which are not really kind of core practices of science, right? They were being told what science is instead of being able to experience it for themselves. Also explicitly pointing out when your students are acting like scientists. So I see a lot of teachers when I go in their classrooms and they call their students scientists, or they'll say, wow, that's exactly like you're doing these things that a scientist does. That's a great question, just like a scientist would have. So providing that recognition for a meaningful science identity. Also making sure that you have multiple opportunities to do science in different ways and places so that science isn't defined as one thing. It's not just following this lab procedure. It really connects to communities, to personal identities, to cultural identities. And inviting all of those identities into your classroom, making space for all of your students to show up as themselves. And what that means, what that can look like is, are you allowing students to talk about science in a way that feels comfortable for them? Are you allowing them to use words that make sense to them? Or are you forcing them to fit into more of a narrow definition of what science is? And then making sure you're providing that feedback for all types of performances, not just letting it be grades or right, wrong answers. So many students that I talk to in their classroom, when I ask them if they're a science person, the only feedback they have to go by is my grades. So I'm a science person if I'm getting an A. I'm not a science person if I'm getting an F, right? Those are the only things they have to determine. And I would argue lots of science students may not be getting A's or may not be doing great on these standardized tests that we know are biased, but they still have the skills and the ability to be a science person. When we think then more long-term strategies, really talking to or interviewing your students to learn about those other identities. So we can't incorporate those identities into our classrooms if we don't know what they are, right? If we don't know what's valuable to them. And similarly, when you talk to students, also think about families, community members, to know what's relevant to them, what's important, what are the issues, the challenges, things that they would like to address using science. Do a STEM resource inventory of the community. And this could mean formal things like museums, like STEM centers, but it can also mean what are the playgrounds that my students go to? What kinds of places do they hang out in after school, and how can I connect STEM to that? Making sure you're presenting science and STEM inclusively. So this means when we show pictures or videos, we don't have those stereotypes of who can do science, right? So we explicitly look for imaging and representation of science that is broader or more inclusive. And we explicitly critique these traditional views of science. And I think this is something, it's easy for teachers to say, oh, I can change out these pictures, but really thinking about, are we telling our students, yeah, that's a very damaging stereotype of science. Here's another way that science can look, right? I think that's an important conversation to have with students. And then reflecting on our own identities as educators and how they impact the classroom, especially if you teach in Clark County. We have students from so many different backgrounds. So many of our teachers, like myself, are white women that don't have the same identities and backgrounds of our students. So really reflecting on that and how they impact your teaching practice. So I want you to take a minute, and you don't have to share anything if you don't want to, but I want you to just reflect on your own classroom or the way that you handle science or STEM teaching, and think about what type of STEM person is currently acknowledged, valued, performed, or recognized in your classroom. And in particular, are there many different ways to perform a STEM identity? When do you give students praise or feedback? What types of praise are available? Is it just grades, or do you have other forms of praise? What chances do students have to perform all of their identities? So not just the science identity, but they able to perform other identities. And are you valuing those identities in your classroom? And how is competence in STEM performed and recognized? Are there multiple ways? Is it just a standardized test or a vocabulary quiz or things like that? I said I was going to give y'all a minute to reflect, but we don't have time. So I want you to keep thinking about that, keep reflecting, because what I want to do next is I want to share with you how some science and math teachers have taken up this framework for identity and used it to work towards social justice in their classrooms. So a few years ago, based on the work I showed you with Ashanti, really highlighted for me what teachers need around support in terms of supporting their students' identities. And I had a great opportunity to work with teachers to teach them about, okay, what is a science identity? What does it look like? What does it mean for you in your classroom? We did some summer institutes, and I got to follow them into their classrooms. And based on that, I started this idea of a framework for social justice science teaching. So these are the things that I saw science and math teachers doing in their classroom that were working towards goals of social justice. So you can see on here, the core is really that strong pedagogy. So do you have a strong understanding of what it means to really teach science in authentic and meaningful ways? And is that coupled with a really deep level of care for your students? So do you really care about their futures, their homes, their communities, and do you care for them in a way that you see that this is why it's important to teach well, to be a good teacher? It kind of goes back to Gloria Latson-Billings. That's just good teaching, right? So this is just good science teaching. And then you can see some of these things happen within the classroom and some outside of the classroom. But I saw these teachers engaging in ongoing self-reflection. Who am I in relation to my students? What does that mean for how I'm teaching? I saw them really critiquing curriculum. A lot of these teachers were given a scripted curriculum or were given specific pieces they had to use. How did they deconstruct those and create curriculum that was meaningful and valuable for their students? These teachers also were able to use this kind of framework of identity to really identify and dismantle some of these unjust structures that we think about in terms of things like standardized testing, school choice, things like that. So they were able to understand them a little better and then use that knowledge to work on dismantling those structures. And then the fourth piece here is that they really built relationships with their students, but also with their communities, with parents, with other teachers. So they had that strong foundation of relationships. A fifth piece that I haven't quite figured out how it fits here, but has been coming up a lot in the last year with teachers I work for, is that these teachers made time for self-care. And I think that's really important when we think about doing this work. All of these things are hard and can be exhausting. And we know when we see good science teachers that they don't stop being a good science teacher because they went home, etc. So I just want to remind you all, with spring break coming up next week, that self-care is such an important piece of this framework. So now I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and I'm going to start with one of our teachers who she taught in what was called a newcomer school. And so most of her students had been in the country for less than a year. They did not have, they were still learning English, so they had a strong fluency in a different language, all kinds of different languages. And a lot of them had come to the United States as refugees, asylum seekers, so they had left a situation that was oppressive and dangerous for them and came here. And a lot of times with the goal of gaining a good education, right? And so she had this moment where she was doing an experiment with her students, and they really wanted to explore and do more. And she was really nervous about it, but she decided to let them go ahead and just explore and see what happened. And she described later that being given that opportunity to explore is dignifying for everyone, but even more so for people like my students who might have been denied that opportunity as they've been marginalized and oppressed. And it's almost like oppression tries to deny people competence, performance, and recognition in science, but also in other things, but creating space for people to grow their competence, perform exploration and critical thinking, and be recognized, whether in a science classroom or in other places, can be a small way to counteract that oppression and dignify them. So she's really reflecting on this idea that by providing her students this space to explore and grow their science identity, she's counteracting the oppression and the lack of dignity that they might be experiencing outside of the classroom. So in this case, she's really kind of looking at that student care, but then she's critiquing, like, what are we allowing these students to do? What are we counting as science curriculum in our classrooms? In another example, Jessica, who was a white woman, she had been an English teacher for many years and was now teaching science. So she really struggled with how to adapt these lessons for students who were, a lot of these were also non-native English speakers, so emergent multilingual students, and she only spoke English. She was really thoughtful and reflective about her role as a white woman educator. And separately, she reflected on what does it mean to teach science through exploration, right? And she talks about, in her own reflections, my race and language differentiate me from my students, but I can also choose to use those things to help equip my students for success in their own lives and for leadership in their community. And she thought about, I really have to choose to give up some of this power associated with being a white woman, with being a native English speaker, to stand in solidarity with my students. So again, we're seeing this interaction between her self-reflection of who she is, how she shows up in this classroom, and her deep level of care for these students, right? And what can she do to support these students? And then another example is from James, who was a white man, and he's a second-year elementary teacher. And he noticed in his class that he had a very diverse classroom, but he noticed that the higher performing students were white boys. And so he started reflecting on this and what his role was in this, saying, I'm being very intentional and very aware of, like, the messages being sent to these students. At some point in the year, his school offered an advanced math program for students, and he noticed that the program was almost entirely composed of white students, despite the large population of students of color at his school. So he brought this up with his administration, and he explicitly pointed to the idea of who are we recognizing as a science person. So the students who are being selected are gaining this recognition, but the students who are not being selected then are kind of getting this negative recognition. They're getting this messaging that they're not being seen as a math or science person. So he discussed this with his administration. He argued for adjusting the admissions criteria that led to more students of color, and particularly girls of color, being accepted into the program. So he's coupling here his ongoing self-reflection of being a white male in this space with what are these unjust structures. So instead of just saying, oh, I guess the white kids just do better in math, which is not a true statement, right? He's saying there's something else going on here. And so he looks at the admission requirements and he advocates for his students in order to allow more of them to participate in the program. And then this, I think this might be the last one. There's a lot of examples. So many good teachers doing good work out there. So this one is Bob, who was a white man and a veteran teacher. And he was really struggling with his students that he wanted to do science stuff with them and cool science, all these cool science ideas. But he felt like this classroom management was not working out well. And in particular, he felt caught between having to enforce the school discipline policies with what he valued in the classroom and feeling like that's getting in the way of us being able to do these sciencey things that I want to do in my classroom. So he decided to begin the beginning of the school year, have a conversation with his students to ask them what they thought about in terms of social justice and science education, instead of those kind of traditional classroom management activities. And he reported that they had this great conversation, and a lot of the students were really concerned about the school dress code. And in particular, they felt like it was racist and sexist against mostly the Black girls in the school. So he allowed the students in his class then to vote on the dress code and saying that whatever you guys vote on is what will be enforced in this classroom. So he gave them kind of a voice there. And then later he said, even though he himself had at times been critical of the way the students dressed, he said as soon as he allowed them to vote and kind of let go of it and let it be their decision, it supported both his relationships with his students and his goals of social justice. And he talked about how now he had such a better rapport with his students and hasn't had any behavioral issues in the classroom that he'd had in the past. So again, he's really focusing on building relationships and also dismantling those unjust discipline structures. And by doing this, now he's allowing his students to engage in those science activities and perform a science identity and bring in other personal or cultural identities that are valuable that they might be portraying through their clothes or their mannerisms or things like that. All right, okay, this is the last one, I promise you. This one is Caitlin, who was a first-year teacher, and she identified as a Pacific Islander woman, and she felt intense pressure. If you're a teacher, you will resonate with this, intense pressure to perform well on standardized tests. So when I first interviewed her, the summer before she even started teaching, she was already talking about these standardized tests and how she had to get her students' scores up. But she, at the same time, felt like these traditional approaches don't feel right to me. Like, I don't want to just have students memorize a bunch of stuff. I don't want to just drill and kill. So all throughout the year, she focused on this. As they got closer to test prep, she talked about, I've been really nervous about reviewing well, but not just focusing on the test. So she resolved to have 4 days out of the week of explore-based review. So she designed these exploratory, inquiry-based science activities that covered the content, but then also gave the students a chance to engage in meaningful science. And she talked about her confidence in figuring out what the students need in terms of preparing them for the test and not sacrificing good science teaching increased. So she was able to do both of those. And she talks about how her teacher heart was so happy to hear my scientists arguing with each other, using evidence, talking about the problem, wondering together. So she's critiquing this standardized curriculum that they have, and also really highlighting good science pedagogy in her care for her students. And by doing this, her students are able to really perform more meaningful science identities and develop the competence that they need beyond just to take tests, but to perform well in science. This whole section I'm not going to have time for because I see it's already 12:48. But the next piece is another research study, and I can share the slides if you're interested in it. But looking at how identities are formed across different STEM contexts. But a lot of times what we see is the voice of the teacher is really important. So I'm going to skip a couple of these slides. Sorry, just blink for a second. And talk about these two different things that we saw. So we interviewed 30 different students now who were in a STEM club about their STEM identities, right? And so in this study, we were looking for what is more impactful of the student's identity, what is having these impacts. And we saw that in about half of the time, the students had a really decisive STEM identity. So we said, are you a science student? And they said, are you a science person? And they said, yeah. And we said, okay, why? And they said, because I like to do science, I like to explore, I like to do all of these different things. And in about half of the time, we asked, are you a science person? And the students said, I think so. And we asked why. And they said, well, I guess I kind of do STEM. I don't really know. So they had these kind of indecisive STEM identities. And so we were curious, why did some students have these strong STEM identities and other students have these kind of different STEM identities? So we looked kind of vertically then, vertically, at what was going on then. So when we looked at these students with these decisive STEM identities, we saw that they had very robust definitions of STEM. When we asked them what STEM was, they talked about exploring and discovering and using tools, and they were able to make connections between what they did in a STEM club, what they did in their classroom, and what they did in their homes. When we interviewed the teachers of these students with decisive STEM identities, so across many different schools, so not just one teacher, those teachers were making those connections for students. They were pointing out, this is science at your home, this is science in the community, this is science in the after school club. And they saw all of their students as STEM people. Let me see. Sorry, there's quotes here. So one of the teachers just talked about the STEM club is great because the kids needs different ways to experience STEM. It can't just be these multiple choice tests. They need to be able to express themselves and see that there's other ways to engage in STEM. So the teachers had these very robust definitions of STEM and science, and then those filtered down to the students. So they had these more robust definitions of STEM themselves, talking about collaborating, thinking things through, sharing things, finding a solution. And then they ended up with these decisive STEM identities. On the flip side of that, we found that when the students had these tentative STEM identities, oftentimes they all had limited definitions of STEM. So they didn't really they would say STEM is science, technology, engineering, math. And that was kind of the end of it. And they didn't see some of these connections of things that they were describing to STEM. And then when we looked up a higher level, we saw that the teachers in these schools or in these classrooms had deficit perceptions of their students, of the families, and they largely focused on behavior, grades, and vocabulary. So in this case, we had one teacher who talked about, if you're a behavior problem, you don't get to come to STEM club. We only want the kids there who really want to be there and learn. So the STEM club itself didn't have any rules about who could come or not come, but this teacher was saying only certain students are allowed here. And then because of that, when the students, we asked them about what STEM is, they would say, well, STEM, like our teacher tells us that we're STEM people because we think really hard and people won't even understand these big words that we use, right? So this focus on vocabulary. Some of the students talked about how only well-behaved kids could come to STEM club, etc. And so then as a result of that, even though they saw themselves as STEM people, they weren't really sure why or how. And so I would argue that's not really a sustainable STEM identity in that case. All right, so that was kind of a quick run through that last study. But overall here, then, the idea is that our students are getting all of these messages about what science is and who can be a science person. And it goes well beyond just what they're being taught of science in the classroom. But as a teacher and as a science teacher, our job is to disrupt that, right? And to start thinking about how do we broaden what counts as science and what counts as a science person. So thinking about your own practice then, and thinking about what counts as science, who counts as a science or math or STEM person, and also how is STEM being used? So is STEM being used as a tool for control? Is it being used as a tool for empowerment? How is it being presented to your students? Are they just learning how to drill and kill, or are they learning how to solve problems in their community, how to better their own lives in their own situations? And then finally, how can we as teachers or teacher educators or researchers really expand what we think of as STEM so that it welcomes and values all students into our classrooms? So I'm going to give you can reflect on that again. There's never enough time to have these discussions. But on that note, if you're local, there is a group that I facilitate once a month on Saturday mornings called Science Teachers for Social Justice. So if this was interesting to you, if you liked this conversation, if it piqued your curiosity, we're a group of science teachers. We meet once a month and we talk about different things related to science identity, equity, diversity, all of these things. We've already had 2 awesome workshops or meetings this semester. We talked about the politics of science and science teaching, particularly appropriate in this current climate. Just last week, we talked about the history of science and education, how that impacts our students and how they see science. And in April, we're going to be talking about culture and community and how that relates to science. And then at the end of the academic year, we're going to be really celebrating science teaching and science teachers. If you're interested in any of those, you can register online. It's a fun time. It's a great group of teachers, and we usually it's an informal way. If you're a Clark County teacher, you do get CU credits for joining. And we try to make that easy for you. And then the last thing to plug is that next month in this series is the teacher's response to student presenting with suicidality, a call to action for educators with 3 amazing colleagues from the College of Education as well. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, or I just saw something pop up on the chat. Youngbach is sharing the link for the registration in the chat. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and we have a few minutes to address those now. The website for the posters I will put in the chat. And I can definitely share the slides. I don't know if they're I don't think they're automatically shared, but if you email me, and I'll put my email back up, or put my email up here. If you email me, I'm happy to send the slides. Yeah, so Nicole asked a great question about bringing race into these conversations. Yeah, and that's a big part of the work that we did initially, is reflecting with the educators on their race and ethnicity and how that impacts how they show up for teaching, and then having those conversations with their students. A lot of this work was done, I don't want to give away all the anonymity, but a lot of this work was done in a state that has a law banning critical race theory and banning discussions around race and identity. And these teachers were still trying to find ways to integrate this in their classroom. And from my own experience as a white teacher, and also from the experience of many of these teachers, they really found that that was a powerful way of connecting with their students, acknowledging this is reality, right? So we know what is happening in the world today around race. We know that this impacts our students. A lot of times we try to position that as outside of science, but it's not outside of our students' lives. So bringing those conversations into the classroom can be a really powerful tool. And a lot of these teachers were doing that and were being very open. So Ashanti, this was a while ago. Ashanti has graduated from high school. She did go on, and so this was in middle school. And another researcher that was a mentor of mine actually worked with her in high school and did report back that she was doing well in high school. I don't know if she went on to pursue science, though. I don't think she did. I think she went on to do more of like a communications type thing. But she was an amazing student, and I'm sure she is doing amazing things now. Any other questions in our last couple of minutes? All right, so thank you all for attending. Yeah, please reach out to connect. I'm actually starting a study to expand this framework, and I would love to hear what you guys are doing. I'm looking for research participants, teachers who are doing awesome work, so please reach out if you're interested. If you want the slides, if you have any questions, just feel free to email me. Yeah, yeah, I know all about Fremont. It's a really cool place. I would love to talk to you more about that, Abigail, and what you're doing there. Yeah, so that's a good point brought up. And this, some of my undergraduate students, when we look at this, have brought this up too, so that awareness and need for mental health services, specifically in marginalized and oppressed populations, I think that could have a lot to do with that, the raise in psychology and some of those social sciences, for sure. Good point. All right, so thank you all so much again for being here. And oh, hey Liz, I can't see who's here, so it's a surprise when names pop up that I recognize. So thank you all for being here and supporting. And again, just reach out if there's anything I can do or any information that you'd like.